And we're back like we never left. Welcome to the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all for spending some of your once again freezing, not so happy hump day here in New York. But once again, we're going to skip past all that promotional jazz and get right to the guts of the episode. Now, I am a historian in general, movie historian. And I am something of a boxing historian, certainly from the early days, whether it was Jim Jeffries, Jack Johnson, you want to go all the way back to John L. Sullivan, James J. Corbett, Bob Fitzsimmons, or if you want to pull all the way forward through the 1990s, my kind of effective range of knowledge is probably just over a century. Don't know nearly as much starting in, let's say, the early 2000s until now. I mean, I still know a decent amount, but nothing like the books that I used to read when we actually all read books, and just general fun type research, looking up, did this guy fight that guy? Did that guy fight this guy? And I used to take out every boxing book I could at the local libraries when I was growing up. It was certainly a hobby to learn about the greats, the great fights, and every now and then on ESPN you would see a great fight. Whether it was an Ali fight or whether it was even something with Larry Holmes or Jimmy Ellis, Bob Foster, I was interested. But there are certain, and HBO did a special, a series of specials, I should say, many years ago called Legendary Nights. And that was the name of the program, where they would take footage, usually the full broadcast, from famous fights and then put a contemporary slant on it or a contemporary spin on that fight, how it came to be and what ended up happening. And so, for example, a legendary night would be the first fight between Ali and Frazier and the third fight between Ali and Frazier and the Rumble in the Jungle between Ali and Foreman. Those were three of the episodes of Legendary Nights. Sometimes it's not a matter of a TV show. You can just use a phrase. And when I talk about legendary nights in boxing, when I think about heavyweight boxing, what are the most legendary nights, or what are the most kind of iconic heavyweight title fights? You want to go more contemporarily, Mike Tyson's 93-second demolition over Michael Spinks in June of 1988. That's a legendary night. It wasn't much of a fight, but we remember it because of the way that Tyson dispatched Spinks, that he made it look easy. It was two undefeated champions. And even though Mike was a prohibitive favorite in that fight, there were very few ringside observers that thought that Spinks even had a chance, because he wasn't necessarily a better boxer than Tyson. Tyson was a lot bigger. It was a bad matchup, but Tyson was just better on top of the bad matchup. Well, sometimes it's a terrible matchup, and we don't explain it that way. But it's kind of like what they used to say about Ali and Floyd Patterson, is that Floyd was fast, Ali was faster. Floyd was quick, Ali was quicker as far as defense, movement in the ring, and he was just a lot bigger. Everything that Floyd did well, Ali did a lot better. Whatever Michael Spinks could do in the ring, Mike Tyson did it a lot better. And the big Spinks jinx, that howitzer right hand that leveled so many light heavyweights, he could have squared Mike up. I'm not sure he would have moved him off his spot. But that's one of those legendary nights. That's one of those where, as fight fans, even if we weren't necessarily fans of Tyson, we can appreciate the spectacle, the drama of what we saw. And I mentioned Ali Frazier 1 and 3 and Ali and Foreman as three others. If you want to throw Rocky Marciano's knockout of Jersey Joe Walcott in a fight that he was going to lose by decision, not just that he ended up winning the fight, but the fact that he almost killed Walcott with one shot. That's something you don't see every day. But 52 years ago today, on January 22nd, 1973, it might not be as flashy as Tyson Spinks, and it might not be the Da Vinci of when Muhammad Ali defeated Cleveland Williams in '66. But in terms of overall import and impact. On January 22nd, 1973, in Kingston, Jamaica, in what was billed as the Sunshine Showdown, the undefeated world heavyweight boxing champion Joe Frazier faced off against his fellow Olympic gold medalist George Foreman in what was supposed to be a competitive fight, but unlike, for example, Ali Williams and unlike Tyson and Spinks, Joe Frazier was favored to win that fight. He was not a live underdog. Well, George is so much bigger. No, Frazier was the betting favorite. And most experts felt that Foreman was too raw and too green. And, maybe he'll get lucky and land a couple of big shots. But the consensus was that Joe was still in his prime. He really wasn't. But he should have been in his prime because he was still in his 20s. But the first fight with Ali took a lot out of him. It had to have taken a lot out of him. So he didn't necessarily look as sharp when he defeated Terry Daniels and Ron Stander. He looked a lot sharper before the Ali fight when he beat Jimmy Ellis very easily, and Bob Foster also wasn't really that competitive. The first round was close, but Foster was another one like Spinks. His left hook, when landed upon light heavyweights such as Mike Quarry, such as the great Dick Tiger, fight's over. It's Rocky Marciano's Susie Q, only this is a light heavyweight in Bob Foster. He landed that shot on Joe Frazier. What did Joe Frazier do? Yeah, come on, Bob. That's what Joe Frazier did, more or less. And even though he's the only man, Bob Foster, to open up a cut on Muhammad Ali, famously in their fight in Vegas, in Tahoe, that was the weirdest venue. It was like a regular lounge to have a comedian, and they had not a heavyweight title fight, but a really important heavyweight fight. But Foster landed the same kind of shots that knocked Quarry unconscious. And Ali's like, come on, Bob, they told me you could punch. But Joe Frazier was undefeated. I think his record was 29-0 when he stepped into the ring against George Foreman. And we don't know what goes through the mind of a fighter. They could tell us what they're thinking, but we really don't know. Because as Ali pointed out, I said I was the greatest before I even knew that I was. So you can say, I'm ready for this fight. You might have doubts. But you can't let people know that you have doubts. You can't put forth an image of anything other than confidence. I think Joe Frazier believed he was going to beat George Foreman. I felt that he's a kid, he's green, I'm going to pressure him, and he's not going to know what to do. Something like that. I don't think that Joe was lying to himself if he thought he was going to win. I think he absolutely did. Joe hadn't lost since the amateurs. If you think about guy winning the Olympic gold medal in '64, running through the heavyweight division, a lot of tough fights, though. Bonavena almost beat him. Jerry Quarry gave him a lot of trouble in their first fight. He had some difficult fights. And then obviously the Ali fight was just unbelievable. Those guys they were in such great condition that at the end of the 15th round, that fight could have gone another 5 rounds. And I've said the same thing about the second fight between them. The 12th round, Frazier and Ali are pursuing as if it's the first couple of rounds. There are certain people that didn't necessarily look like they had the incredible body, but they had the amazing stamina. We've seen it with Tyson Fury. It looks like he's 50 pounds overweight, but the guy never seems to, earlier in his career, like when he fought Deontay Wilder, he seemed to have endless cardio. George Foreman, for all of the talk of he's raw, he's still green, he's had more fights as a professional than he had as an amateur, whatever people were saying. Unfortunately for Joe Frazier, his style was all wrong for George. And it's not something that people necessarily would have talked about before the fight because you can't know. If you have two evenly matched or close to evenly matched fighters, there is a situation where you can say, I think this guy is going to chew up the other guy because of how he fights. Sometimes there's just too great a disparity in talent and it doesn't matter. In this instance, you could argue that Foreman had greater natural talent. Foreman was right in his prime. He was hitting his prime. And Joe was a little bit past it. But I think even the Joe of the Ali fight, I don't think he does that much better. The problem for Joe in this kind of fight and why it was such an awful matchup is because he knew one way to fight. Joe had to fight moving forward and pressuring his opponents. He was a great pressure fighter. Mike Tyson, they usually call him swarmers. Mike Tyson, you could argue, was, because he was faster, was a swarmer, but he was also a really good boxer, especially in his younger days. Tyson could outpoint you. He didn't just have one way to win a fight. But George Foreman, this dreadnought in human form, this hulking brute, this incredible, amazing talent. He said he was scared. I don't believe he was scared. I think George felt, I can beat this guy. I'm not just going out there to make a good showing. I'm going out there to win this title. And the reason why this is comparable to Ali's 3-round Da Vinci level dismantling of Cleveland Williams, the most beautiful spectacle of one guy beating the crap out of another guy would be that fight. Tyson over Spinks is just brutality. It's just, an obscenely talented young man in that instance of Tyson just putting one over on an all-time great, but not an all-time great heavyweight, And Spinks also was past it. But there's no version of Spinks that can stand in there with Tyson. Tyson was just too damn good. He was just too good. There were very few people that you could say historically at any time in their careers that would have been favored to beat that particular Mike Tyson. Maybe Ali of 66 would be one of them. Maybe the George of this fight, because he was bigger and because we saw what he did to Frazier, and Frazier and Tyson were similar fighters. Mike had more skill. He had different things he could do. But if Mike came in too quickly and George landed one of those uppercuts, it's just not something, you don't even want to think about it. Foreman versus Frazier. What George did 52 years ago tonight is every bit as impressive as what Mike did with Spinks and what Ali did with Cleveland Williams, if not more so, because he was facing a fellow all-time great. And that's really the difference. Joe had tough fights, but he had never lost. The closest he came to losing, I think the Bonavena fight, he almost lost to a 3 knockdown rule. He was floored twice, and he barely survived the round. I believe that was the closest that he came in. And Quarry had him in trouble, but Quarry, the tendency to cut, not Mike Quarry, the guy that the guy that Bob Foster beat with the left hook that sent him to the hospital was Mike Quarry, the brother. Joe fought Jerry Quarry, and Quarry gave him a lot of trouble until I think he had a cut. They had to stop the fight. The same thing that happened Quarry in the first fight with Ali in 70, where his eye was just busted open. There were just some people that tended to, puff up and get those sorts of lacerations. But it's the fact that Joe was undefeated champ. He had beaten Ali. He had looked great beating Bob Foster. He looked terrific in the Terry Daniels fight. And when he beat Jimmy Ellis to get the title, fantastic. I mean, he was just running through people. He was mowing them down. And then he goes up against George. And within 30 seconds of the first round, it's just all wrong. You can see that what Joe is doing is not having any effect on Big George. And George just had the look of somebody who knew he was going to win. This time, it worked out. Because he had that look in the first 5 rounds or first 4.5 rounds of the Ali fight. Even as he was being peppered, he still looked like, I'm going to win this fight. George just went out there, and the Styles making fights angle is that he knew that Joe was going to come to him. Joe was going to try to crowd him. But George, who took those crazy wild swings, the anywhere punch, as Ali always said, those weird roundhouses, didn't really throw too many of them in this fight. He shortened his stroke because he didn't have to generate on his own. He could wait for Joe to come in and hit the short shots. You look at the uppercut that Foreman landed for the first knockdown in this fight, and the famous call of down goes Frazier is what I'm referring to. George landed a couple of chopping punches. He knew that Joe was a little bit wobbly, still dangerous, and George later said that Joe unleashed a hook that I just got out of the way of, that it came at me like a bullet, like a piston. Whoosh. He said, I don't want to get hit by that. I got to get this guy out of here, or words to that effect. But if you look at the fact that when Joe came in, George landed this very short, very quick uppercut. And historically, you know what it reminds me of? It reminds me of the uppercut that ended the Cooney fight in 1990, the famed walk-off uppercut. That's the only fight in history that it was the walk-off uppercut, using baseball references in boxing. But in that case, that's exactly what it was. He had Cooney hurt. He knocked him down in the second round. Cooney looked like he was okay, got up, walked over to George, and George just basically landed an uppercut, froze Cooney in place. The fight should have been stopped right there. Then George landed another right for good measure, and Joe Cortez pulled him off and waved the fight over. But that was an example in 1990 of George throwing. You can't throw it any better for the supposed raw and green. And even in later years, Foreman threw those weird roundhouses. When he had to deliver a certain kind of shot, he could do it. It was short and tight, and it did the job. Well, the uppercut that knocked Joe down, he barely winds up. He sees he has a hurt fighter. Joe goes into the crouch. This is, again, why people think, historically, if you put 1988 Mike Tyson against the George Foreman, the Tyson that beat Spinks against the Foreman that beat Frazier, Tyson goes into that crouch. You don't think that he's going to get hit by one of those uppercuts? He is. He's going to have to do a lot of damage. He's going to have to do a lot of damage to the body. I think that I got Foreman winning 6 times out of 10. 73 Foreman versus 88 Tyson. I'm sure I'm going to get flamed in the comments for saying that. I'm sorry. But Tyson being more skilled than Frazier, the gulf is not that wide. You know, prime Joe Frazier versus Tyson, it's not going to be an easy fight for Mike. Better get him out early. You know, if he doesn't get him in the first 5 rounds, he's not winning the fight. He's certainly not going to win a deep water fight against a guy like Frazier, who he seemed to get better as the fights went on, even as his face got puffed up. Frazier had just endless stamina. And even in this fight, if Mercanti hadn't stopped it, he was just going to keep getting up. There was something deep in Joe Frazier's wiring. He was never going to quit. He was willing to die out there. But on this particular night, once Joe went down for the first time, even though he bounced right back up and Mercanti wiped off his gloves, he seemed okay, but he wasn't. It wasn't a flash knockdown. There have been flash knockdowns. There are flash knockdowns. They happen all the time in boxing, where fighters get hit with huge punches, but it might rattle them. They jump up and they're okay. You know, Ali, his first fight when he was Cassius Clay against Sonny Banks, the first time he was knocked down in his pro career, Sonny Banks landed a howitzer of a left hook on him. And Angelo Dundee years later said, when I saw that punch and the way it landed, I thought my guy was done for. He popped up at the count of 3 and he knocked Banks down before the end of the round. So it was a punch that shouldn't have been a flash knockdown, but it didn't quite get him in the sweet spot, and Kid bounced right back up. Well, as much as Frazier seemed to be okay, knocking his gloves together, let's go, he wasn't. And he went down 2 more times in the first round. And if it had been anything other than a heavyweight championship fight, they wouldn't have let Frazier come out for the second round. There was no reason to let the fight continue. And we can sort of criticize Arthur Mercanti for not stopping the fight sooner, but this is a very difficult part of being a referee and even at being a fan, because there have been fights that were stopped too soon, and then there are fights that go on too long. There's no way to get it right 100% of the time. And Mercanti, many consider to be the greatest ref ever. He did a great job in the first fight with Ali and Frazier. He kept the guys apart. I think he had a scorecard in that fight as well. But Joe shouldn't have been allowed to come out for the second round. There wasn't any point. After the knockdowns, his left hook didn't have the same snap that it had in the first minute of the fight, even though he really didn't land. Maybe he landed one of them. And the second round was just more of the same. And it's kind of sad. It's sad listening to the commentary of Cosell, and Angelo Dundee was sitting next to Howard. I don't think that he was working the fight as a commentator. I think that Howard asked, would you like to sit with me, Angie? And so, because he didn't have a microphone. But as Frazier gets knocked down for, I think, the 5th time, you hear Angelo Dundee screaming, "Stop it, stop it, stop it." It's like, but he's a champ. You want to give him every opportunity. But the amount of damage, the extra shots that he took, I mean, George wasn't out there to kill him, for crying out loud. So finally, the fight was stopped after the sixth knockdown. And damned if Joe didn't get up cleanly at least 5 of the 6 knockdowns. I mean, it wasn't even like that it was more and more difficult for him to get up. Like, it didn't even make any sense. He had to be unconscious. But he was going to get up. He was just going to keep getting up and keep slamming his gloves together and keep going out there and trying to throw punches. I think the quote that Foreman gave also in later years was, "I didn't really stop Joe. The referee stopped the fight." He won the fight, but he didn't really, in George's mind, Joe was just going to keep getting up and he was going to keep trying. He was not going to stop throwing punches in my direction. Even if he wasn't there, he was still going to be firing away at me. That was the fighting spirit and the heart of Joe Frazier. Things like heart are sometimes overrated in other sports, but in boxing, where you're talking about consciousness-altering punches where for a matter of seconds, the lights go out. Well, the lights probably went out for Frazier. By the second time he was on the canvas, I don't think that he was really conscious. I don't see how it was possible. Somehow he kept pulling himself up and he kept competing and trying against a guy who was just bludgeoning him. You look at the Foreman of that fight and you understand why people thought that he was invincible. Because you couldn't see any other heavyweight. This was the best heavyweight out there in Frazier. And the fight was not even close to being competitive. In its way, it was as dominant as Tyson over Spinks or Ali over Williams. And because Joe was undefeated and presumably was still at the top of his game, that's what made it more impressive. Historically, there was no way I don't think anybody predicted Foreman by 2-round TKO. Foreman in a cakewalk. Sometimes guys just take crazy guesses and it ends up being right. But I don't believe that any of the boxing experts of the day had Foreman just walking through Frazier in the manner that he did. So after that fight, Joe didn't get an immediate rematch, kind of needed to go back to the drawing board. I don't really know the mechanics of why he didn't get an immediate rematch, but it didn't end up happening. And George fought Joe Roman, which was a real action-packed, I think it was only 1 or 2 rounds. But Joe Roman was a tough fighter, and he came to fight. George was just too much for him. You know, he just pretty much crushed him. And then George beat Ken Norton in Caracas. That was also not a competitive fight. And the heavyweight eliminator on January 28th, 1974, the second fight between Ali and Frazier, also at the Garden. Ali ended up winning that fight. He had split 2 fights with Ken Norton the previous year. So the timing of the Norton challenge to Foreman never really made any sense to me, because Norton beat Ali, the famous fight where he broke his jaw, and Ali either went 12 rounds with a busted jaw or only a couple. Nobody really knows for sure. Because Ali said, "I think the guy got me in the first round." And then the implication being, that he was so tough that he fought 12 rounds with a broken jaw. But Norton always said, "I don't think that I hit him hard enough early. I think the jaw might have broke more like round 9 or 10. Nobody really knows. It doesn't matter. Fighting with a broken jaw, even for a minute, can't be good. It's got to be beyond horrendous. But Norton took the first fight in 12, and then Ali took the second fight in 12. And both fights were split decisions. They were neck and neck, and either guy could have won. More people would have thought that Norton could have won the second than, for example, Ali winning the first. Even though it was a split decision, most people felt that, no, Ken did enough to win the decision. He definitely landed the more telling blows and all of that. But the fact that Ali won the fight against Norton, the return match in September of 73, I'd always just thought it was strange that Norton then got the title shot. And the eliminator was between Ali and Frazier. The second fight with Ali and Frazier is a very good fight. But compared to fights 1 and 3, I mean, how could it would have to be the pitched battle at that level. And it's not. It's just a really good heavyweight fight between 2 guys who were in such exquisite physical condition that it is unfortunate that it wasn't also a 15-round fight, because the 12th round is the most exciting round of the fight, and not because Frazier thought he won the fight. He didn't. It's an 8-4 fight for Ali. I don't think that Joe did enough to win more than 4 rounds. But both guys went out there to try to take the other guy out in the last round. And that's what you want to see. You want to see the champions, the champion level fighters at this time in the careers of both Frazier and Ali. Just let it all hang out. And they were winging and throwing, and Ali got to do the Ali shuffle, and he's dancing and moving, and he's hitting Frazier with lefts and rights, and Joe's loading up on the left hook. It's a great fight. It's not the fight of the century, and it's not the Thriller in Manila. And then history tells us that Ali went to Zaire, Africa, and he beat Foreman. He beat him from here to there. And watching the fight now, because through the miracle of YouTube, but the miracle of having video that used to be very difficult to come by, and you have to rely on the occasional few clips here and there, as opposed to getting to watch an entire fight 30 years ago on a VHS tape. It's still different. But the mythology of the Ali Foreman fight was that George was just loading up and he was beating the hell out of Ali, and then he got tired and Ali caught up to him. That's really not what happened. Sometimes the mythology of the fight takes over, and it isn't until we're able to see things for ourselves that we say, well, some of that is true. Foreman did land some punches, but it's not like he was necessarily winning the fight when the fight ended. I mean, I would have had it probably 4-3 for Ali heading into the 8th and final round. But just because George was loading up, he was very active, but he wasn't landing that many telling blows in the first, 4 rounds. And then the 5th round was George's big round until the last 30 seconds where he almost got knocked down. And if there had been another 10 seconds, George might have had to take a knee because he was really just getting plastered. He shot his bolt. And that's the thing. When you throw those big shots, when you miss, it drains you. It takes a lot out of you. And a 2-round fight, you're a trained fighter. You're not going to run out of steam in 2 rounds, at least not very often. It would really have to be a hell of a 2 rounds. Was it Bobby Chacon versus Ray Mancini, where both guys looked gassed in the first round because they were just throwing bombs and getting hit. Put those two together, and you may run out of steam early. I mean, Foreman and Ron Lyle. Ron Lyle lost. It appeared that he collapsed almost from exhaustion, just throwing and throwing and throwing and taking shots. But 52 years ago tonight, George Foreman's Sistine Chapel, his Da Vinci, his Ali Cleveland Williams, Mike Tyson, Michael Spinks, on January 22nd, 1973, the Olympic champion became the world heavyweight champion. And for George Foreman, oddly enough, it was just the start of his life's extraordinary journey. This has been episode 414 of the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all for spending some of your freezing Wednesday evening here with me in New York. If you check out this episode on the YouTube channel, haven't done so already, please click like, subscribe, comment, share, turn on those notifications. Or if you catch this episode on the audio platforms such as Podbean, Spotify, iTunes, or the others in which we're hosted, same general rule applies. Click like, subscribe, share, and turn on those notifications. I'll be back with a new episode real soon. Till then, peace.